whatever we do for one group of people should be something that all people can own, acknowledge and value. And yet the way this process developed from 2015 onwards, it has been very much the property of Indigenous people, in particular a certain Indigenous leadership. So had it been done differently, with one or more constitutional conventions, perhaps with elected delegates as well as appointed delegates, I think not only would we have better teased out all the impact of the particular proposal or any alternative proposals, but I think there would be a much greater sense of public ownership of this, because the last thing we want is a referendum proposal that fails. That would leave Australians embittered and divided, but I suspect that if this succeeds, it will likely also leave us embittered and divided because of the process which has got us to this point. So as I said, I would hope, I don't expect, but I would hope that the committee might recommend that we go back and start again. But if it's not prepared to do that, I do hope that it will recommend some significant changes to the wording, as I say, to ensure that it's not the High Court that in the end has the last word as opposed to the Australian people, and to ensure that this doesn't amount to an effective veto on the workings of government.
And when you reflect upon that 1998 Constitutional Convention, you were firmly in the no group, but when you observed those who settled on a model, did you see that process encourage compromise and agreement making between various groups?
That's a good question. As you might remember, the convention itself could not come to a clear view. The Prime Minister of the day, John Howard, I think quite sensibly decided that the majority Republican position, even though it wasn't the majority convention position, should go forward so that we could have our say on this important matter as a nation. But the majority Republican position it went further than some people would like, but it didn't go as far as other people would like. And so if this committee is, in effect, a de facto mini convention, it may well be doing everyone a favour were it to ameliorate some of the sharper, more difficult edges of the proposal as it currently stands.
And at that referendum, it wasn't just a referendum question about becoming a republic, it was also, it had a question about recognition. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that has been put as to why that did not get up is that it did not have Indigenous support. Mm-hmm. And it has been put to this committee, and in fact more widely, that this form of recognition has Indigenous support. So how do we reconcile having recognition that has Indigenous support but is constitutionally sound and gets the broadest possible support in the community?
Yeah. Well, Keith, there are Indigenous people on both sides of this. I think it's wrong to say that Indigenous people overwhelmingly support the proposal as it currently stands, because I just don't see any objective evidence to that effect. My understanding from people who've been touring Indigenous communities is that some are for, some are against, in particular because they think it might undercut the authority of the traditional owners and others who currently do have substantial authority, and many are simply confused and undecided. And again, I think the abbreviated way this whole process has taken place has led to that. So I think it's quite wrong to say that Indigenous people are in favour of this and maybe the rest of us aren't so sure. I think there's confusion and division everywhere, uncertainty, lack of clarity everywhere. But the other point I'd make, just to finish, is the Constitution belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to those whose descendants were here 60,000 years. It doesn't belong, ancestors. It doesn't belong to those whose ancestors have arrived since 1788. albeit an overwhelming majority of Australians, the Constitution has to belong to all of us. And that's why, as far as is humanly possible, this should be a uniting process. But I don't think that's the way it's panned out, at least recently.
Thank you, Mr Abbott. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Clayton. You have the call.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr Abbott. I'm just wondering if you've had an opportunity to read the Solicitor General's advice now and to give us a summary of what your takeout there is.
Well, the Solicitor General, as I understood him, is minimising the risk, but he doesn't rule it out. He simply says that, in his opinion, the High Court would be unlikely to find various ramifications. Now, look, the Solicitor General's view has to be taken seriously, but as we know, Solicitors General don't make these decisions. The High Court makes these decisions on what the Constitution means. The Solicitor General was in fact significantly wrong on a recent matter involving indigeneity, namely the Love case. While the Solicitor General is a distinguished lawyer, no doubt about that, other lawyers of no less distinction, such as former High Court Judge Ian Callanan and former Federal Court Judge Terence Cole, have come up with a very different view, as has probably the most distinguished constitutional lawyer never to go on the High Court, who also made a representation to you.
Mr Abbott, I think you've occupied the highest political office in this nation.
Yep.
You know how power is exercised. I want to take you to some recent comments of yours where you compared the proposal for an Indigenous advisory body to the British House of Lords. Mm-hmm. And there's perhaps no greater symbol to elitism, frankly, in the United Kingdom than the House of Lords. When I look at the situation here in Australia, where we've got a life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, about a gap being about 8 years there. The mortality rate for Indigenous children is twice that of non-Indigenous kids. Fewer than 70% of Indigenous Australians finish Year 12 compared to over 90% of non-Indigenous. You know that there are significant gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians when it comes to employment, to rates of incarceration, childhood development, suicide, the list goes on. Can you see why complaining or comparing about an Indigenous advisory body, the purpose of which is to improve outcomes for the most historically disadvantaged and disenfranchised group of Australians, the First Nations people, to the British House of Lords, how that might be considered offensive?
I can appreciate that not everyone likes the comparison, but in this important respect, it's correct. The House of Lords, at least prior to reforms in the late 1950s, was entirely hereditary. And this voice will be hereditary in the sense that to be a member of the voice, you have to have Indigenous ancestry. So to that extent, it is an entirely accurate comparison. Now, I absolutely agree that we do want to do much better by people who are doing it badly. I should make a distinction. Not all Indigenous people are in the same boat. Yes, overall Indigenous people have significantly worse outcomes by many indicators than the rest of the Australian community, but this is vastly more so in remote Australia than it is in non-remote metropolitan Australia, for instance. We absolutely have got to do the right thing to improve life expectancy, to improve employment, improve housing, reduce domestic violence, all those things. But I regret to say to the committee, there is no persuasive evidence that the voice is going to do that. The best thing to improve remote Australia, that all of us, I think, shy away from, the kids have got to go to school, the adults have got to go to work, and the police have got to keep communities safe. Now, we look at what's happening in Alice Springs right now. It's a policing problem. We have two extremely prominent voices, Indigenous voices, Marion Scrimgeour on one side of politics, Jacinta Price on the other side of politics. Their voices have been substantially ignored. They think the grog has got to go out, the police have got to go in. The problem is that politically correct thinking says, oh, no. This is not the result of poor personal choices. This is not the result of bad decisions by government in the last couple of decades. This is the result of intergenerational racism and colonialism. Well, to be honest, this is not the way forward to focus on these sorts of things.
Mr Abbott, I accept that's your opinion. It's not shared by a number of people giving evidence to this committee. I also remember you articulating those same concerns in 2014 when you were in a position to do a lot about it. And when you were confronted with that choice, you chose to, in fact, cut money from Indigenous organisations on the ground in your first budget in 2004. I was in the Parliament with you at the time. I remember it well. And that decision was raised in the regional dialogues again and again as one of the issues that why communities absolutely needed to support a voice to avoid this kind of top-down decision-making from not just yourself but anybody in this position where there's this sort of top-down approach to decision-making over lives, intimate and all aspects of people's daily lives. I haven't finished the question yet, but what do you now say to those communities after, a decade of failures and more? People have said more of the same is not an option. The status quo is not an option in terms of delivering practical outcomes on the ground. So, you did support back in 2017 a referendum for the voice. I'm not entirely sure what's changed. Maybe you might like to talk to us about
I've never supported
why.
the voice.
Your constitutional recognition back in 2017.
I've certainly supported constitutional recognition. I've always supported constitutional recognition. And
so what is it about a representative advisory body, if there'd been a representative advisory body in place when you were Prime Minister perhaps, do you think that your government would not have benefited from that advice?
Well, I did have an Indigenous Advisory Council which had some wonderful people on it, including the former President of the Australian Labor Party as its chairman. But look, I reject the idea that money is the key thing here. Money is important, but the important thing is not how much money is spent. The important thing is what outcomes do we get on the ground. And there's been no lack of spending over the last 3 or 4 decades. The spending has been an avalanche of dollars, but it has not been reflected in better outcomes for Indigenous people. The key thing is the attitude. And frankly, at the heart of the dysfunction right now is a sense of separatism, and this Indigenous voice, constitutionally entrenched Indigenous voice, is going to make this sense of separatism worse. What we should work towards, and to our great credit as a nation are working towards, is get more Indigenous people in the National Parliament. I mean, the National Parliament is the voice of all Australians. It is the voice of the governed to the government. The fact that there are 11 individual Indigenous voices in this Parliament today is wonderful, and let's continue and improve on that.
One last
Thanks,
question.
Mr Abbott. Nobody's going to take their foot off the pedal in that regard, I'm sure. But I am interested to know what's changed for you in 2017 when you were prepared to sweat blood to ensure constitutional recognition. Where in 2023, why change?
I think it was in 2014 that I said I was prepared to sweat blood. It was a speech I made to recognition at Redfern in late 2014, which I would commend to the committee. I still think it is important that we achieve Indigenous recognition, but this is so much more than recognition. This is about government. I don't want to change the way we're governed. I just want to acknowledge the fact that Indigenous people were here first and should be respected as the first Australians, and that's why, if it were me, I would amend the preamble after one indivisible federal commonwealth with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character under the Crown, because it's undeniably true. It would become a good shorthand way of describing Australia, and it would mean that there is something for everyone in this constitutional change.
Thanks, Ms Clayton. Senator Cox, you have the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Abbott, for your submission and also for appearing today at the committee. My question is about your submission, actually, and just to clarify Ms Clayton's point on your quote about some of the key features of ordinary Australian life, and you quoted that kids need to go to school, adults need to go to work, and communities need to be policed. So is that, I'm just clarifying, you believe that the lack of policing is the issue in First Nations communities?
It's one of them. It's absolutely one of them. I mean,
besides the fact of racism of police, lack of cultural understanding of police officers, we need more police officers in First Nations communities.
To give you a practical example, when I was the Minister for Health, with whole of government responsibility for the APY lands in the Howard era, the APY lands, an area about the size of Scotland in northern South Australia, about 3,000 people living there in 5 significant communities, or 5 separate significant communities. There were eight policemen for that vast area, 8 resident policemen for that vast area with 3,000 people, and they were all based, I can't remember what the particular settlement was called, but it was where hardly any Indigenous people lived, and they used to refer to it as the Canberra of the lands. All the 8 police were based there, which was at least 2 hours' drive away from the nearest substantial settlement. At the same time, in New South Wales, a town of about 3,000 people, about half of whom were Indigenous, there were 30 resident police. So there is absolutely no... Ceduna, a South Australian town of about 3,000 people, at that time had 27 resident police. So there is absolutely no doubt that large swathes of remote Australia are very substantially under-policed. And this, to be honest, is why there are so many issues of dysfunction in some of these communities.
Thank you, Mr Abbott. Well, as a former police officer who worked in the largest policing jurisdiction in the world, in Kalgoorlie, in the goldfields in regional Western Australia, putting more police officers in that community won't do much if there's not basic necessities such as housing, amenities, internet, phone services, after-school programs, connection to culture and country. These programs need to be led by First Nations people. But on the aspect of culture, you've also mentioned this in your submission, that in fact, this stems from a misguided view of the role of culture. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, culture is obviously very important, but in the end, I would like to think that what unites us as Australians is more important than anything that divides us, and I would like to think that culture evolves, and it evolves in ways which will bring us over time to better places. Now, obviously, Indigenous people should respect all of the things that have helped to make them who and what they are, but that's not simply the Indigenous element. I mean, as Jacinta Price often says, you know, I am a proud Walpiri Celtic Australian. There are many strands in culture, and even for Indigenous people, I suspect that the Indigenous strand is but one.
So just to clarify, Mr Abbott, you're saying that you don't believe First Nations people who have different cultures should be taken into consideration when we are talking about a voice to Parliament, even though there are different faith groups and different refugee and immigrant groups that call Australia home that are in fact afforded that exact right. So are you saying that First Nations people don't deserve that?
I'm not saying that at all, but if I may come back to you a little there, Senator, I mean, we are proposing a special voice for Indigenous people, but we're not proposing a special voice for migrants. We're not proposing a special voice for people based on religion. I don't think anyone should have a special voice. I think everyone should have the same voice. And the voice of all of us is the National Parliament. That's why probably the single best thing that's happened for Indigenous people over the last decade or so is the very big increase in the numbers of Indigenous people in the Parliament. 11 separate Indigenous voices in the Parliament today, not because of quotas, not because of affirmative action, but because political parties and the people of Australia, in their wisdom, thought that Indigenous people had the qualities to represent all of us. And I applaud that and I thank God for it.
Mr Abbott, in your time as a Special Envoy to Indigenous Australians in the Parliament, and also occupying, as Ms Clayton said, one of the highest offices in the country, can you tell us about, you had a very keen focus during your time as a Special Envoy in relation to school attendance for First Nations people. Can you, and obviously there's a decade worth of reports that have talked about strengthening connection, making sure that we've got bilingual education that's available,
Senator
culture,
Cox,
the importance of family.
Senator
Can you
Cox,
talk us through
Senator Cox,
what it is? Sorry.
I'm just going to, before you get to the end of your question, remind you of relevance.
Yes,
so
thank
you
you.
can
Thank you,
get
Chair.
there.
When we talk to the issue of having a voice to Parliament, how important is it to have that voice, but also for that voice to be heard by people who occupy those positions of office?
Well, it's incredibly important that Indigenous people are heard, but this particular voice, I think, is not the right way forward. Now you're right. I've always taken a very close interest in Indigenous education because, in the end, if you don't have a job, you won't have anything like the sort of life that Australians should have. And if you haven't been to school, it's going to be very hard to have a job. So better housing, better health, more prosperity, it all starts with good education. Now, you're not going to get a good education unless you actually go to school. And in remote areas, about 60% attendance is considered good. And frankly, I think 60% attendance is often looking on the bright side. So we really do have to get more kids to school. And I think if there were more decision makers, I'm not talking now about politicians necessarily, but I'm talking about the people that actually run schools, run police services, run health services. If more of that was done closer to the ground, all to the good. One of the things that I put forward back in the day when I was the whole of government minister responsible for the APY lands under John Howard's prime ministership was appointing a Commonwealth representative to the area, someone who would live at least 10 months of the year on site, but was a person of considerable authority and clout, such as a retired member of Parliament. Indeed, when the Howard government commenced the intervention, these government business managers were supposed to be something like that, someone who could say to the school principal, to the police sergeant, to the council manager, to the clinic manager, look, we're all operating in silos. We should be all operating in a more holistic way to actually make people's lives different and better on the ground. So look, I am all in favour of people being heard, but I am absolutely certain, knowing government as I do, that only some people will be heard via this voice, not the people who really need to be listened to. And let's face it, in Marion Scrimgeour and in Jacinta Price, this Parliament has two very powerful voices from Alice Springs. Were they heated on grog bans? No. Are they being heated on police? No. Because it seems to me that what the government has currently in mind is going to listen to some voices and not others.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions we have for you, Mr Abbott. Thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate the chance to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.